is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 377. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. LSV, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Good. We've got Aether Revolt specific show this week that's going to be kind of a combo pack. We've got the rest of the questions. It turns out I asked for questions on our Patreon last week for our mailbag for Aether Revolt, but we got way more than we could answer on the show. And I figured there's some really good questions here, and let's finish these up. We're going to answer the rest of those today. And then we've got a section on sealed as well, just because we know how important sealed is, and we like to touch on sealed for each format. So we're going to give you some high level stuff on sealed as well. Before we get into the show itself, I want to thank our sponsor, channelfireball.com. They are the place to go on the internet for anything you need Magic related. And I say that because they really do have everything there. They've got, sealed product. You can buy boxes, you can buy booster packs, whatever you need for there. They've got singles. Of course, you can pick up the cards that you want specifically for your constructed decks or for your collection or whatever it is that you're going for. And they've got, product for playing Magic, like sleeves. Big deal. You're going to need sleeves if you're going to play Magic seriously to protect your cards. And of course, it can make them easier to shuffle for some people and stuff like that. Deck boxes. They even have Limited Resources, branded stuff like sleeves, deck boxes. You can even get t-shirts and hats and all this other kind of stuff. And then while you're there, you can sell your cards back to them, and you can read and listen to and watch awesome free content by some of the best players in the world. It really is a complete package, a one-stop shop, if you will. And I encourage you to check out channelfireball.com for all of the things that they do for Magic. And of course, the show is brought to you by you, the listener, via Patreon. That's a website that you can go to support the things that make you happy. The show's free. That's not changing. You're going to get the show either way. This is for people that want to give back, that they feel like, I've gotten a lot out of this and I'd like to support you guys and help it so that you can keep growing the show and doing that kind of thing. That's what this is for. And this is the new way that things work. It's fantastic. And you know what? If you can't afford it, if it's not in the cards for you right now, no problem. Don't worry about it. The Patreon will be there when you're ready. If you do want to check it out, it's patreon.com/limited resources, and it opens up a lot of cool new features for you, including I'll post some of the videos that I make. In fact, I put up 2 videos this week on the LR YouTube channel, and I'll usually post them over there as well. I put up a new depth check video. You can check those out. These are the videos that I edit down to about 35 minutes. It's a full draft edited down to that, and you get to watch all of the games. I speed them up and I voice over them. And then also I'll go super deep on one subject per depth check. In this case, it was a mulligan decision. And we did the math on that, and you can hopefully learn something from those. Again, those are on the Limited Resources YouTube channel. Also, every episode of the podcast goes up there as well. For now, they're just audio form. But, for some people, it's easier to get to. And if you go there and you subscribe on the YouTube channel, you'll see whenever a new episode goes up there. And then also whenever any of the extra content that I get to make as a result of the Patreon goes up on the YouTube channel there as well. One other thing you get is you get to submit questions for the question of the week. You also are eligible for giveaways. I've got 2 of those to do this week. But before, let's do the question of the week. This one comes from Tyler, who says, "Hey guys, having both played and covered feature matches at high level Magic, what should we as viewers know that isn't obvious from watching coverage?" I thought that was kind of an interesting question, Luis, because there's a lot of different ways that we could take that. What comes to your mind when you ask yourself, what isn't obvious to the viewers at home that are watching?
The funny thing is the first thing that sprung to my mind, and I don't really know why this is that people who play at the PT are actually a lot less strict than you might think, or at least they're less cutthroat, I guess is a better way of saying. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of camaraderie between the players. Yes, these matches are for high stakes, and both players care about winning, and it's important to them, but they don't tend to be jerks about it. Like these players know and respect each other. They are generally not trying to pull fast ones or be rules lawyers or anything like that. So I think you'll encounter a lot more of that at like the PTQ type level than you will actually at like the Pro Tour. And I think that's something that a lot of people just don't realize when looking at it from the outside.
Yeah. The thing that came to mind for me was from our perspective in the booth, which is that I think a lot of people don't realize how many people are talking to us in the booth while we're actually on the air. We're monitoring multiple streams of information. The first and foremost, of course, we have a computer monitor in front of us that has the same stream that you see. And yes, by the way, I am commentating it, and Luis and I, we commentate off of the exact same feed that you do, with the life totals and the names and the little, things scrolling on the bottom and all that kind of stuff. I'm looking at the same screen you are. So if you ever wonder, well, how did he know what card was in hand? Well, we have the card in hand viewer, but I'm usually just looking at the screen and watching. But also I'm monitoring the Twitch chat and a Skype channel that we use for our production. We're also monitoring the cards in hand iPad that we have in front of us. On top of that, we have up to 3 different people talking to us in our ears at all times as well. And so we've got quite a bit going on. We've got the director of the show. We've got our big boss that runs the whole show. And then we've also got our floor reporter that's actually in the feature match area, all of which can talk to us and we can talk to them while we're on the air live. And so it is interesting when you realize how many different streams of information we're actually monitoring, and maybe it makes a little more sense when we miss something as a result.
Yeah, we are getting a lot of information from a lot of different places. Yeah. I'm not getting a whole lot from my co-commentator usually, but I do get a lot from Twitch.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Tyler, for the question. And like I said, if you're on the Patreon and you're a supporter of the show, you do get access to the Question of the Week thread. I'll update it every month or so, and you can put your questions in there for consideration on the show. Another thing you get by being a patron is you're automatically entered into the giveaways. And I love giving stuff away to help say thank you to our loyal supporters. And I've got 2 different things to give away here. The first one, let me see if I can find it here somewhere. There it is all of the Crack-A packs we do, and any packs that I use for the show for really any reason. I keep all the rares and special cards, and we give those away to you, the listeners. And I've actually got a pile of them here. We went through quite a bit of cards, and I think I threw in some extras of my own here as well. First and foremost, though, Luis.
Yeah?
This is very important. That Lurgoyf is in this pile.
Which Lurgoyf?
The
Lurgoyf, yes.
Yes, this pristine, pack-fresh 8th edition white-bordered Lurgoyf is going to be given away here. And then also, when I send it to you in a limited resources deck box with a package of limited resources sleeves in there for you as well. And these ones are going to go away to Bethany Lundy from Missouri. Thank you, Bethany, for your support. It is much appreciated. And I will be sending this off to you soonish. And then the other thing I'm giving away here is I've got one of these dual decks. I've got a Knights versus Dragons dual deck. It's got Knight of the Reliquary and Bogardan Hellkite as the 2 main cards. And I don't know, somebody said this is worth something now, but whatever. I'm shipping this off, and this one is going to go to Elizabeth Rice from South Carolina. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your support of Limited Resources. We really appreciate it, and I will be sending this Knights versus Dragons off to you. More giveaways to come as well. I've got a bunch more stuff that I'm going to be shipping off. And of course, we're going to start rebuilding the cache here of our Crack-A pack rares. And I've got a rare right here, a pack right here from Xander. This is from GP Pittsburgh. Thank you, Xander, for the pack. This is, of course, a Aether Revolt pack. So let's get into it. First card off the top is Conviction, which you and I decided it's okay, but we don't really like it, right?
While it has gone up in the power rankings, it is not a card I would consider first picking.
Right. Yeah. Improvement does not mean first pickable. Shock. Okay. If I had to first pick Shock, would I be happy or sad? I think I would be slightly on the sad end of that spectrum. It's not a great card. It's a good card, not a great card. Taken to Custody, the blue Shock. No? You're not buying that?
I've never seen that card played. It took me a second to remember what the card was.
Oh, wow. I already stumped Vargas.
I got it. It's 1 blue, taps a creature, doesn't untap, but it's just not a thing.
So it's not from Morningtide, is that what you're saying? Next up,
look,
Unbridled Growth. By the way, we got a few more packs for Let's Stop Vargas in the future, and I got some doozies in there. Like, hold on a minute. I got to grab this. Hold on. So, in my hands, I have a Fallen Empires pack.
Ooh, I'd actually be pretty good at that.
Now, remember, there's only 8 cards in there. Anyway, we're going to do that another time, though. I'm just foreshadowing a future LSV. Unbridled Growth is our next card.
Not a big fan of taking this early, though. It is a good card in a Revolt deck.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a fine Magic card. The thing is, the floor is high enough on it that you can just play it, cycle it, call it good. And then, the times when it actually enables a splash or a revolt, it's actually okay. Like you said, though, you just don't need to take them super high. Night Market Aeronaut. God, this card is disappointed. I really just don't think this is like a fringe playable.
Yeah, it is not a card I've seen enter as a 3/3 very often.
Right. And even when it does, that's good, right? Like I'd play that all day, but it just never feels like, I can never beat that or whatever. It still dies to enough of the removal, I guess.
Well, it's also, you can't do any work. If you do any work for it, it's just basically not worth it.
Right. Next is Aether Herder.
Yeah, it hit a little worse than I expected it to.
Verdant Automaton. Ugh.
Not a great card, no.
Augmenting Automaton. Even worse.
A little better, actually.
Oh, I think it's worse.
I think Augmenting Automaton is actually playable because of Improvise.
Oh, sure.
Verdant Automaton doesn't really get there on that.
That's true. Yeah. Augmenting Automaton being in black doesn't set it up perfectly for Improvise, but there are some Improvise cards.
Yeah, get some Fen Haulers in there.
Yeah. Aether Inspector. Inspection failed. Card has not been good.
Worst of the Aether ones for sure.
Definitely. Here's a card that I hate it when my opponent draws, but I end up not playing it super often. It's Implement of Examination. This is the blue implement, so it's 3 mana to cast it, and then you can pay a blue to sack it. You draw a card, and when it enters, and when it dies, air quotes, you also draw a card. So it's a draw 2 for 3 plus a blue mana.
Playable card, but not a very exciting one.
No, I just hate it when I finally whittled my opponent down, and then they play this,
and they just drop that. Yeah.
This is one that we talked about on the set review quite a bit. It's Gremlin Infestation. This is the 3 in a red aura that enchants an artifact. And at the beginning of your end step, it does 2 damage to that artifact's controller. And then if that artifact dies, you get a 2/2 Gremlin. I was down on this pretty hard on the set review. You were much higher on it than I was.
I am now more down on it. I have not seen this card do a whole lot. So
the water is nice and warm. Welcome.
Yeah.
And I'm not considering picking it here either. All right. We finally found a card better than Shock. Monstrous Onslaught. 3 GG sorcery, deals X damage divided as you choose to any number of creatures, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control as you cast it. That was a key thing that we zeroed in on the set review as well, is that they can't interact with this. It's not a fight card where they can say, okay, kill your biggest creature. Now you're only doing 2. This just does that much. And it's been powerful. I've been impressed by Monstrous Onslaught. It would be my pick at this point.
Yeah, I think Monstrous Onslaught is good, and certainly not a card I'm unhappy to first pick.
Okay, now what about this next one? Because this is a card that I have played against and I've been very impressed by, but I never seem to have the deck for it. I never seem to get to play it. I don't even know if I've ever resolved it. It's Tezzeret's Touch. It's one. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say this. The 1 blue-black makes a artifact, enchantment makes an artifact into a 5/5. Then when the artifact dies, you get the artifact back.
It's good.
Yes, it is a very good card.
I think I'd rather have Monstrous Onslaught, though, rather than a gold card.
I would also take Monstrous Onslaught because not only is Tezzeret's Touch a gold card, it's also a card that requires artifacts. So it's almost like a not a 3-color card, but it has more requirements than just a gold card, and gold cards already have a lot of requirements.
Hey, this is cool. I agree with you, by the way. I just think the setup cost is too high in Tezzeret's Touch compared to just a really good card like Monstrous Onslaught. That does also have its own setup cost, but I'll tell you what, I can make this entire discussion a completely moot point.
Oh.
Walking Ballista.
Yeah, sure. Walking Ballista is just one of the best cards in the set.
One of the best cards,
for an XX, and you can remove a counter to deal 1 and pay 4 to put another counter on it.
Done. Yeah. Windmill slamming Walking Ballista.
It's a colorless bomb.
It's a colorless bomb, right. And whenever they print these, by the way, Luis, it bothers me. Because I know that they need to exist, but I think about it from terms of limited. And this one's seen a lot of play in constructed. So if that's the case, fair enough. They got to put these cards somewhere. This would be a weird mythic. But, from a limited perspective, I hate it when these Aether Sphere Harvesters, or, even going back a ways to like some of the modern master sets that have like Karn or things like that. It feels like it makes your first pick a non-pick, right? You're just like, well, I have to take this. This is the best card. Now, you're excited about it because it's a great card, but I always seem to have a little bit of a reservation with just a card that has no downside effectively, right? There's just literally no deck in the format where you wouldn't play a Walking Ballista. And I don't know. I find that uninteresting on some level. Again, I understand that this card isn't here to appease limited players, but still I'm like, yawn, Walking Ballista, obviously. Next card, thanks. Also, when you translate it over to sealed, it's just like every Walking Ballista that ever has gotten opened in Aether Revolt sealed just automatically gets played. And I don't know. I find that a little narrow.
Yeah, this sounds like I'm sure you've been treated to the Ben Stark rant about this, but the cards that are needed for constructed that ruin limited and Walking Ballista, I wouldn't say it ruins limited, but yes, it is very, very good.
He would say that.
Yes.
And by the way, I've been treated to every Ben Stark rant, so I'm deeply familiar.
You've gotten a pretty good selection, I would say.
I mean, I've got multiples of most. Like my Ben Stark rant collection binder is overflowing at this point. I've got play sets of some of them.
Binders full of Ben Stark rants, yeah.
Yeah, but the truth is I kind of enjoy them. so I don't complain. I mean, I could just tell him, hey, I've heard this, but I don't. I like it when he goes off. All right, so Walking Ballista. And by the way, yes, that goes in for the giveaway of those. So that'll be sitting in there. Okay, let's start answering some more of these Aether Revolt questions and then we'll talk sealed. First one comes from Farhan, who says, one, are there any difference between sealed and draft in the format? And I'm just going to answer that one right now. Yes. And we will talk about that at the end.
Yeah, we did it.
Yes. And then, but he's got a follow-up question. How high do you have resourceful return?
So this is 1 and a black sorcery, get a creature back from your graveyard. And if you have an artifact, draw a card.
Yeah. It reads like if you control an arm. Yeah. It reads like a perfectly fine card, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you read it, you're like, hey.
A relatively easy 2-for-1.
Yeah, but I actually don't play it very often, and I don't see it played very often either. I think this Tezzeret's Touch deck would be the place where I'd maybe want to run one of them. But even then, I'm not really excited by it. I don't take it highly. I often end up cutting it. It ends up being my 25th or 24th card, so it's just gone. I don't know. It just doesn't seem to really come together enough for me, even though it feels like it should. Like reading it, I don't really have any complaints about it.
Yeah, I have not been impressed with the card, even though it looks fine.
Yeah. You more likely to play it, with bombs, or does that affect your decision?
If you have bombs that are creatures, you're either Spear Harvester or Walking Ballistas, that makes it a little better. I do want to mention that both this and Gremlin Infestation, kind of one of the things you get from playing a lot of the format, because I've managed to play a decent amount since the Pro Tour, is you get a sense about cards without necessarily thinking about it, right? Like you're a bunch of drafts in and you think back and you're like, yeah, Resourceful Return really hasn't done much for me. Yeah. Like you weren't doing those drafts to figure out how good Resourceful Return was, but you still kind of know how good it was for you because you think back and you're like, wow, I really never played this card and it wasn't that good. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting to that's just one of the things you get from practice.
Well, and to take that one step further, one of the things that I like to do at the beginning of a format that's very similar to what you just described is when somebody says, I think this card's great, or it's going to be awesome, or it definitely is just going to be sweet. And I have my doubts about it. Like you mentioned Gremlin Infestation, where I'm like, well, this, and this. And I'm just like, I don't know. This is another good example, Resourceful Return. I look at it and I think, okay, like that seems like a fine card, right? What I do is I let other people test it for me. And what I mean is I just pay attention to what my opponents are doing. And the number of times that somebody's played Gremlin Infestation and I cared is 0. And I've played a lot of the format now. And the number of times that somebody has played Resourceful Return and I thought, oh no, like what a backbreaker, is like 1, maybe. Somebody just had like a late game rip where they drew a bomb and drew a card and I'm like, okay, now I'm just screwed, when we're both top decking or whatever. But overall, I don't fear the card. I don't take it highly. I don't think that I can't wheel it. And when my opponent plays it, I shrug. I'm just like, whatever, that's fine. You can play a Resourceful Return. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not. And the truth is, nobody plays it. You almost never see it played. And to me, that's enough. That's the machine doing the work for me. And I know that I don't need to dive in and break it. And I always find that really interesting because when this comes up the most, Luis, is when flashback drafts happen. Because I'll go back and let's say in a year and a half and it'll be like, it's either Revolt, it's back. And I'll be like, okay. And I'll fire up a draft and it'll be 11th pick or 12th pick. And I'll see a Resourceful Return and I'll be in black and I'll be like, well, what's wrong with this card? you know, but after having played the format a lot in the moment, I know that that card just doesn't rank up well enough against the other stuff that you can be doing. And so I don't end up playing it. But it is funny because, again, you read the card and it's like, there's not a lot to hate about the card, right? It's a fine version of that type of
it looks
effect.
fine.
Yeah. So, yeah. Interesting stuff. You know, I really do like to let other people do that work for me. If I start getting my butt kicked by resourceful returns, I'm like, all right, I don't want that card. All right. Next, Paul says, Cruel Finality. I seem to always see this card being passed late in the draft, like 5th or 6th, and that pushes me towards black. Is this card bad, and therefore I should not read this as a signal? There's kind of 2 questions there from Paul. The first one is this card bad? And the answer is no, it is not a bad card, but it is not a great card. I think I overrated it a little bit early in the format. I had to turn that knob a little bit down. I think it's a good card. I think it's playable. I think you'll run the first one for sure, and the second one probably, the third one maybe not so much. But Paul follows up with, and therefore should I not read this as a signal? And I think that no, you should not read it as a strong signal. I think that the format has recognized that this card is a little expensive and doesn't quite kill as much of the things that you'd like to kill with it. And they've adjusted accordingly, which is why you're seeing it 5th or 6th, which is more where it should go than what it did in the early stages of the format where it went 2nd, 3rd, 4th, something like that. So yeah, I don't think it's a bad card, but I don't think it's as good as it looks. And I don't think that you should, read it as an overly strong signal, because remember, and Luis, we talk about this all the time, but not all signals are equal, right? Like some are stronger than others. And this is like, I would call it like a medium signal. If you got a 6th pick, a Cruel Finality.
Yeah. Medium at best. It's the card is just underperformed a little bit.
Yeah. And I think that's just, you're seeing the natural reaction to that among.
Yeah. So when you're looking at signals, it's not just how good is this card. It's like, how much do I value this card relative to how much everyone else does? And if you value it higher than other people, you're going to overvalue it as a signal. Whereas, they might have taken like a Defiant Salvager over it because that's what their deck wants. And it's just, in a lot of decks, just a better card. And then you see Cruel Finality and you're like, wow, this is a signal, where if you had maybe seen the other card, you wouldn't have thought that because you think Cruel Finality is much better.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, Greg Holmes says, how important are long game resource sinks in this format now? Are some of the weak mana and energy sinks more worthwhile now with the speed of the format? And I think that's a really interesting question for this. The energy side of it, I don't find... I think that like the energy decks just pop up a lot less frequently than they used to. Right. I've drafted it maybe 3 times or something where I've said, okay, I've got an actual energy deck on my hands here. And that was mainly because I took decent cards out of the first 2 packs and then just got the energy payoffs. And I just got lucky. I got a Whirler Virtuoso or whatever. But these days, for the most part, the energy part I just discount because I just don't ever plan on being in a dedicated energy deck. Now, when it comes to late game mana sinks, that's much different. And I think that they're as important as they can be, right? I mean, as they ever are, which is that they are something that you should consider if you've got a lot of mana sources and not a lot of top end. And I think that there's something that if you can put into your deck without crippling other aspects of it, you should always do. That's something that I'm always looking to do, is to have places to put my mana late in case I flood out or in case I need something to do. And cards like, what's that stupid card called, Luis? The one that copies artifacts for 7 mana?
Cogwork Assembler?
Yeah. Cogwork Assembler is the perfect example of this.
Well, it's almost one of the only examples.
Yes.
Which is why I knew that was the card I was picking up too.
You were,
because
okay.
This format is pretty light on that.
Yeah. And so in your mind, does that make the ones that you do get more important because they're more scarce?
Yes, it does. But them being weak still just means they're weak. It's not like it automatically makes them better. It's just like, if this card's a 3 out of 10, the fact that there aren't very other options doesn't make it more than a 3 out of 10, really. Mm-hmm. Like, it makes it a little bit more important because you do need some, but a bad card is still a bad card. I'm still not like looking at Verdant Automaton and thinking like, yep, I've got a mana sink. Now we're doing it. Exactly. It just means that this format just doesn't have good ones.
Right. Yeah. The interesting thing is that I've tend to draft 2 different types of decks in this format. And the first one is what we would call a cab style deck, a cards that affect the board state deck. Creatures, removal, combat tricks, get you dead. I draft those most of the time. I would say 3 out of 5 or maybe even 3.5 out of 5 or something are decks that I'm just looking to do a more consistent, streamlined game plan of getting my opponent dead. But the other 1 or 2 draft decks that I have do tend to be the long game. I have a great 7-drop type deck, and these do pop up more for me in that. And I do, cause I'm looking for inevitability. Cause when I draft those decks, I'm trying to build a deck that allows me to get to the late game with a reasonable life total at a reasonable board state. And when you do that, you need to win the game then. You can't just have more of the same defensive spells and, tricks and things that just try to keep you alive. You do need some way to end up winning that game. And what I look for is inevitability, and that can come in many different forms. I had a draft deck that's going to go up on Channel Fireball pretty soon, where I opened a Johnny. And so that was my primary game plan. My primary win was going to be a splashed a Johnny. But, I also put a Cogwork Assembler in that deck, and I could go off with that. I also put some card draw spells in that deck. So, I want to feel like I have multiple forms of inevitability to make my opponent answer multiple things. A powerful Planeswalker is one of them. A Cogwork Assembler with the right build can absolutely be one as well. So I think you tailor it to the deck that you have, but you don't artificially inflate their value just because.
Yeah, I would not go out of my way to find these things, and just know that if you have one of the good ones, then yeah, you got there, and some formats have more than others.
Yeah, and by the way, Verdant Automaton, really not a good one. All right, this next email comes from Edward, who says, "Hi, men. Listener since Brian." I like it how Brian is now just a time. He exists in eternity as a time. He says, "I'm a 54-year-old who discovered this game 4 years ago through my boys. I love it and find it extremely challenging and frustrating with all the variants. I've been drafting more than ever since the creation of leagues." So Edward clearly is playing on Magic Online as well. Bravo, Edward. That is the way to go if you want to improve. "I find my local game store experience rewarding. In-pod matches and varying talent pool makes me feel like I'm improving. Online, I feel like I'm very overmatched. I've never gone 3-0. And by the way, this is typical. The online competition is much stronger than you'll find at your typical local game store. If you just pop in there, as Edward noted, you're going to have a lot of varying skill levels. There's going to be one person in the store who's kind of, the best player by default, and you're going to have players that are brand new, and sometimes you'll even have a younger person who's very new to the game and is just kind of playing for fun. You're going to see a wide range. On Magic Online, you'll occasionally get a player who's still learning how to play Magic, but for the most part, they're good. I mean, the competition, it's really good, right?
I would say that the average 8-4 or competitive league is on par with day 2 of a Grand Prix, and it's actually, I've had pods in the Pro Tour that were worse than I thought in 8-4.
Yeah, for sure.
I as someone who at this point primarily practices for the Pro Tour via Magic Online, I found doing 8-4 drafts on Magic Online to be sufficient practice for the highest level of competition.
Yeah. So
that says a lot about
it's a lot
you find there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Edward says, "My question is, I think my in-game play has improved with reps and exposure to the cards. I feel my weakness is reading the signs. I find my decks okay, but I appreciate the synergies and strengths of my opponent's decks. I assume the talent level and greater experience by most of my opponents accounts for the difference. Any guidance?" And he says, "Thanks for making my drive to work enjoyable. I appreciate your approach to life and value the humor in this day and age." Thanks, Ed. We appreciate that as well. So this is something that I think a lot of players at Ed's level experience, which is that they feel like they're picking it up, right? They're not just floundering, right? He's not just sitting down and just randomly picking cards and just throwing things into a sleeve and seeing what happens. He's putting mental energy into, power level of cards, individually speaking. But what he's noticing is that his opponent's decks, they seem to have another level to them, right? They're all energy cards, or his opponent's playing implements and then running out these Bastion Inventors on turn 4 and things like that. And his decks may be compiled more of a grouping of pretty good Magic cards rather than the synergy. And I do think that there's a level up there for Ed to hit, which is for me, what happened was I would draft decks that were how I described the first one, filled with good cards is what I would say. Like if you just took every card in the set and gave it a number ranking from 1 to 10, and then you took the deck that I drafted, it would end up being like a 6 or a 7 or maybe even an 8 sometimes, or on average, right? Like my overall card quality was good because I started to understand how to evaluate cards. But what I didn't understand was how the cards work together and how that would actually go. Because for me, it was hard for me to see those things because I still was learning just on an individual card basis what made it good and what didn't. And so after a while, what ended up happening was I ended up talking to BDM and actually Dave Williams and stuff. And I was like, I needed to really push my boundaries. I realized that I was a little too contained with the cards that I would consider playing in my decks. And I needed to just say, screw it. I'm going to try something completely out of my normal comfort zone. And that meant ignoring, getting on the path for a deck, like an improvised deck, and just being like, I don't care if it costs 1 mana and it's an artifact, I'm taking it. I don't care. Like, I'm going to pass removal spells. I'm going to just push hard in this direction. And once I started doing that, I have to say that it didn't make those decks that I drafted were not the best decks that I could draft because I was being so, pushed over in one direction. But it opened up doors for me mentally to see what those decks were really about and what was really important in those highly synergistic formats and builds. And then I could gradually scale that back to meet a little bit closer to where I was at with it. As far as, combining some of my card evaluation skills and risk reward, abilities to that. And that's what I think you should do, Ed. I think you're ready, buddy. I think it's time for Ed to, start drafting some crazy decks that, yes, admittedly probably won't earn him that 3-0 necessarily, but he's going to learn so much that on the next set and the next draft that you end up picking up a lot after that. That was probably a long time ago for you, huh?
Yeah, I was trying to, when you were describing this, I was trying to think when I made that jump, and it was a long time ago, but I will admit that I'm someone who, one of my weaknesses in draft is I actually overvalue synergy and cute things. Mm-hmm. And so I was already on that page from the beginning.
I see. Interesting. You actually had to come the other direction.
I did. That was one of the things, speaking of Ben Stark, that he really did a good job beating out of me was that you can't always draft the control deck or the deck that's all, synergy and combo. Sometimes you just have to draft a curve deck. And now I know how to do that. But for a long time, I would always just draft these nonsense decks. So, I don't remember the first time that I did that.
You drafted a real card?
Yeah, but it was a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah. But I would encourage you, Ed, to push in that direction and just try to just go hard in one direction. And then you'll learn a lot. And like I said, the best balance is when you can push hard in a direction, but still recognize when it's correct to just take a raw power level card over a synergy card, and also start to realize when you can get those synergy cards back on the wheel and you can take something more solid to give you a better, more well-rounded deck. Okay, next question comes from Chris, who says, hey guys, for Aether Revolt, I've been having relative success with draft while struggling in sealed. Perhaps it's because I see this as a fast format. He says, I haven't yet had any success with control. So I'm building faster sealed decks, which aren't cutting it. I recognize the format slows down a turn or two for sealed, but I can't seem to find a balance of yet. Thoughts on sealed versus draft specific cards in the format? Thanks, fellas. Now we are going to cover this when we go down there. Did you have maybe a snippet for Chris just to kind of whet the appetite here?
I think that the one of the bigger differences here is, like a lot of sealed formats, that I'm a little bit more okay with putting an artifact removal card in my main deck, Appetite for the Unnatural or a decommission or something along those lines.
Okay. We'll talk about that more. Seth asks, hey, Marshall and Luis, love the show. I've got 2 Aether Revolt specific questions for you. 1, true or false? This is a 16 land format.
True.
It's true. It's an interesting question though, right?
Yes, it has some implications. In this particular case, it's, I think, a combination of improvise, low curve, the lack of mana sinks we talked about. You're more likely to want 16 than 17, I believe.
Yeah, there's also cards that lead you towards 16, like Attune with Aether and Renegade Map, that kind of just act as a land themselves. There's also so many cheap cantrips. All of the improvises, with the exception of the blue one, are relatively cheap to get going. And then you've got random cards like Unbridled Growth and things like that just effectively replace themselves immediately. And that also lends itself to a scenario where you would feel comfortable running fewer lands rather than more. That said, I have run 17 in many decks as well, because if I don't have those and I'm not an improvised deck, and I have like a normal curve, I will still just run 17. Like, I don't think that this is a format that just dictates that you run 16. It's just there seems to be a lot of cards and synergies that makes it so that it's way more often that you run 16 than 17 than a normal format. Do you agree with that, Luis?
Yeah, those are the things I said.
Okay.
I thought that your conclusion was then to move on to part 2.
Okay, I will do that. What does a good improvised deck look like, says Seth? I haven't been able to find the balance.
It has 16 lands.
Or maybe even fewer. He says, I haven't been able to find a balance for it yet, so I end up with a pile of good stuff instead of a synergistic deck. There's another question I believe we have in here too about, or maybe we talked about it last week a little bit, looking for the pieces and what I mean by that is what makes up this deck, like how many enablers, how many payoffs. And, we were saying we wanted 5 to 7 enablers and, 3 to 4 payoffs to be considered an improvised deck. So.
Yeah. And if you end up with a pile of good stuff instead of a synergistic deck, you kind of haven't drafted an improvised deck, because if you have improvised cards and cheap artifacts, you already are a synergistic deck. It's not that complicated. So
no, it's really not.
Maybe you're missing on one of these aspects. I don't know which one. Or you start out by thinking you're drafting an improvised deck and just you don't see the cards for it, which will happen sometimes. So you're not always going to get to draft the deck you want.
Right. I mean, if you have 2 Sweatworks Brawlers, 2 Bastion Inventors, and a Barricade Breaker, you definitely have an improvised deck. Now, the question is, did you enable it properly? So, and you can look, how many cheap artifacts do you have? It's that simple. And those are the things that you want in there. The on-color implements are your best, especially in that deck. It would be the red one, as it's cheap and can cycle for free, with no target. So yeah, don't overthink it, Seth. Just look at how many actual improvised cards you have and then see if it's properly enabled. And then you've got an improvised deck. Aston says, can you crew a vehicle with walking ballista?
Yeah, of course.
Aston follows up with, surely it's not walking anymore then.
Well, the ballista can still be walking, right? It depends on what kind of vehicle it is.
I can't really, like if it's in a copter.
Well, if it's like pushing an Iron Shred Crusher, right? Like it's a pretty big walking ballista, just like behind it pushing it.
Okay. All right. I guess we'll have to bring in the flavor judge for that one at some point. Killian says, after watching Paul Cheon's video on the Channel Fireball Aether Revolt Limited meeting at the Pro Tour, I realized how high the pros pick creatures these days. I find it difficult to accept that Daring Demolition is worth an Aether Chaser pack one, pick one, even though I understand the rationale behind it. What are your opinions on where to pick strong creatures versus average to good removal? Do you think people should be picking creatures more highly, like Sam Black seems to be doing, as well as many others on these pro teams? Love the show. Keep doing what you're doing. Interesting question from Killian here, because this does reflect the current state of Limited, and it has been the current state for years now, by the way. This isn't something new, which is basically just that the creatures are now better than the removal. That didn't used to be the case, but it is now.
Yeah, it's just a card quality issue. Like, if Aether Chaser costs 3 and Daring Demolition costs 3, yes, Daring Demolition would be much better, but Aether Chasers cost 2.
Mm-hmm. Bless you.
I'm allergic to bad removal is the thing. So it just happens that the bad removal, or like the common removal, is not bad. Daring Demolition is a fine card. You always play it. It's a good card, but it's just not as efficient, and we harp on this a lot. We're going to mention it later. When the power levels line up like that, it's more just a power level thing. It's not – when you say something like how high the pros pick creatures these days, I can already tell that, like – I mean, it's a good question, but you kind of don't understand how they're evaluating the cards. They're not saying we want creatures more. They're just like, this card is better.
Right.
It's not saying we value creatures higher than we used to. It's we just value good cards, and it just happens that the good cards are creatures. Pros don't think, oh yeah, I need to pick some creatures. It's like, well, Aether Chaser costs 2 is a very efficient card, or Aether Swooper, those are both very good, whereas Daring Demolition costs 4 and is not quite as efficient as you would hope.
Yeah, it's relative, right? I mean, that's the point here, right? Is that the creatures in this case are relative to the removal spells. And if you compare the two, the creatures end up being more powerful than the removal spells. It's better to be proactive than reactive up until a point, because there are removal spells that do trump the creatures. You won't see people taking Ether Chaser over Harness Lightning. Now I realize they're not in the same pack, but you get what I'm saying, that, instant speed removal spells that can kill even large creatures are still absolutely at a premium. And they're much, much better than those other types of cards. But when you start looking at the mediocre removal spells, those creatures are just better. All right, Matthew says, rank all the removal, which maybe we'll throw a few of them at Matthew here. He also says, is Gonti's Machination still bad?
I dislike this question.
Which part of it?
I don't want to rank all the removal. Gonti's Machinations is still bad.
Okay, yeah, that part was easy. As far as the removal goes, it's not super hard. I mean,
basically, you could probably just line it up by casting costs, and you'd be pretty close to it.
You'd be pretty close. I mean, Shock would be the exception, but we've done shows on removal, and maybe this is just a sign that we need to revisit this because it has been a while. But talking about what makes a good removal spell, why we care about removal, that kind of thing. But like Louise said, I mean, if you listen to the show, instant speed is always better than not. Unconditional is always better than not. The ability to get 2-for-1s or interact in combat is an absolutely key piece of the puzzle, and that's what's going to put the removal up into that premium status. James says, hi, Marshall and Louise. Thanks for the great content. I was curious to see what TMCFB had Consulate Dreadnought rated. I was curious to see that Team CFB had Consulate Dreadnought rated quite highly in their team meeting. I've always found that card does very little other than tapping for improvise. I was wondering if you know what their reasoning was and whether your opinions on the card have changed. And we did talk about this card a little bit on the last week's show, but just to reiterate, yes, our feelings have changed. I think this card is better, much better than I gave it credit for originally. I actually think it's a pretty good card now. And when I first saw it, I thought it was a bad card. So it's very rare for a card to take that big of a swing. It's usually more like, and then it ended up being like, or sometimes it's like, yeah. And then you're like, nah. This one though, absolutely is a card that has switched from bad to good for me. And, yes, you can tap it, for improvise, which is pretty powerful. But I think that as long as you're cognizant of drafting 3-powered creatures around it, it's also just a powerful magic card. It's not a bomb. I don't have it super high. It can be chump blocked all day, that kind of thing. But it is just bigger than everything else on the board, period. And the key thing that we mentioned last week that holds true is that you get to cast this effectively for free. You get to just find turn 1 as a good place, or any other time where you just have an extra mana floating around to get this thing on the battlefield. Where when you look at some of the big vehicles with high crew costs from the previous set, they cost 4 and 5 mana. I mean, you have to take an entire turn off just to get them on the battlefield, and that's just way too much to ask. This one does not ask that, and like you said, it also works with improvise.
Yeah,
I like the card now.
Yeah, I think it's actively good, whereas I was with you. I was in the same boat about the boat, that it just looked very bad. But I think Aradar Express soured us on high crew costs. But It turns out costing 1 mana, that actually just does change the calculus quite a bit.
Yeah, it does. And 11 toughness is there's just almost no combination of creatures, even if they stack block, 3 or 4 of them on your creature, that actually gets that thing dead without losing most of theirs. So yeah, it turned out they pushed that boundary, and it's big enough. Okay, a couple more questions here. This one comes from Andrew, who says, what do you guys think could have been done to fix Revolt in this format? Was it that the payoff wasn't good enough, or that the enablers were too inconsistent? Or could it be if the format was fast enough that playing and cracking implements was too slow for what Revolt gave you? He says also the amount of X1s in this format. Do some of the one-sided board sweeps look better, like Make Obsolete or the Hornet, the Foundry Hornet? Love the show. Currently listening to old episodes on episode 104 right now. Just to mention that, by the way, Andrew's going back through the catalog, which you can do. You can find them, of course, on your podcast app, but also all of them are up at lrcast.com under the episodes tab. There's every episode we've ever done, going back to number 1. So first question from Andrew was, what would be done to fix Revolt? And I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this, Luis, because as a game designer, I'm sure you have an opinion on how Revolt turned out and if there was anything they could have done to make it better.
Yeah, I don't think that the actual mechanic Revolt necessarily had to be at the power level it is. It's not intrinsically underpowered or anything. It just the enablers and the payoffs just don't line up quite right. To make it something that you actively go after. Since, it is fine, and you're going to play, like Vengeful Rebel is a good card. It's just the 3/2 that gives -3/3 with Revolt. Like, if you have that card, you'll try to play it. But it turns out that most of the Revolt cards are like the, Night Market Aeronaut that just gets a +1/+1 counter. It's not worth jumping through hoops for those. So I think if you have increased the power level on the Revolt cards, that would have been the first place to start, most likely. Because the enablers actually do seem good enough. The Implements, Unbridled Growth, Scrounging Bandar, that sort of thing. Those are good enough to play by themselves and do the thing you need it to do. It just turns out there weren't, especially at common, enough reasons to actually do it and to go out of your way to get Revolt.
So is that something you would have done? Because because one way to fix the problem would be to incentivize us with cards more on the power level of Vengeful Rebel rather than Deadeye Harpooner. Yeah,
I don't know that you need a ton more because you don't want a bunch of bomb uncommon type cards at common, but look at cards like Sweatwork Sprawler and Bastion Inventor for improvise. I feel like those cards were absurd. They were just good enough to make the cut, and they're good enough to draft improvise decks around. I think you could have pushed Revolt a little bit and still gotten there. You don't have to go all the way.
Yeah, because that's the interesting thing that I see is that it can be hard, right, to do that. Like, you don't want to create a mechanic that polarizes the cards in such a way that they either do almost nothing or they're really, really good. Because then it creates these incredibly swingy games that aren't really that fun, I don't think, for either player. Nobody feels good if you play a Revolt card with no Revolt and it's just trash, right? And you're just, and your opponent's like, well, that card doesn't do anything. And you're like, yeah, I just don't have anything else to do. Go. And at the same time, on the other side of the spectrum, if it's I lined up my Revolt cards and now I just go off, your opponent's like, really? I can't ever beat that because you assembled this kind of somewhat hard to assemble thing. And even for you, it probably feels pretty good from that perspective. But I mean, it's a fine line, right? You could tell that they were trying to not let these cards get out of hand by making the Deadeye Harpooner super conditional, by making the, Countless Gears Renegade just give you the one servo. What if it gave you 2 servos?
Right. And part of it is that would be pretty snowbally, right? If you got to play that on the play with a 1-drop Revolt enabler. But
right.
As it turns out, I think that they may have they hit a little bit lower probably than they could have. And that's something that it's hard to get right. I mean, it's part of development, but you change the numbers on a few cards, like you said, and then maybe you get there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if because it seems reasonable what they did. 3/4 flying or 3/3 flying for 4. That's cool. There's a lot of good ones, but they just didn't quite get there. Second part of the question from Andrew was, with the amount of X1s in this format, do some of the one-sided board sweeps look better, like Make Obsolete or Foundry Hornet? And the answer is, yeah, they do. They're just better. Even cards like Fireforger's Puzzle Knot have become playable in the format, given that there are reasonable threats, even some of them uncommons that cost 2 to 3 mana, that you can kill just with half of a Fireforger's Puzzle Knot. And if you're talking about cards like Make Obsolete, they can be a blowout. They really can. So yeah, I think the answer to your question, Andrew, is yes, absolutely. Those cards have gotten better.
Certainly.
All right, one more question before we talk sealed, and then have a kind of a funny sign off. This comes
as opposed to normal.
Yes, as opposed to normal. This one comes from Carrie. He says, really appreciate the teaching and trolling that happens on the show. Speaking of, a couple of questions. One, how many main deck artifact removal spells are appropriate? Let's just answer that one from Carrie straight away. Carrie, if you mean specifically just artifact removal spells, there's only 2 that come to mind. There's Natural Obsolescence, which I think you can main deck, though I don't. I usually leave that one in the sideboard. But if I'm short of playable, no problem. It will be in, and I think it's close. And then the other one is, what is it called? Destructive Tampering?
Yep.
And that one I do main deck, because of assuming that the other ability would be relevant for my deck, especially in a green-red deck or something like that. Because it does have flexibility that lets me get extra value, and it's just that close to getting over the edge. If, Carrie, you are instead talking about naturalize effects like decommission and unnatural or appetite for the unnatural, I do main deck one of those. And I feel fine with that. It hits enough enchantments. There's a lot of enchantment-based removal in this set that I feel like it does warrant, and then of course all the artifacts, that it does warrant an inclusion. And I will always put the first one in my main deck and under most circumstances. Where are you at on that question, Luis?
Basically the same. I would probably not play I would play 0 dedicated anti-artifact cards and like 1 upside anti-artifact card.
Yeah. Next question from Carrie is, how highly would you take removal? AKA, how many removal spells is too many? I find that if I don't take removal immediately, I never see any.
This one's a little tricky because, kind of, as we went over before, removal's not at its peak right now. But there's a big difference in 0 removal spells and 2 removal spells. So having like Caught in the Brights or a Shock or, a Chandra's Revolution, just so you can kill your opponent's like good creature is pretty important. But I still tend to not overvalue removal compared to like not removal cards. Like if you see that, an Aether Chaser and you see a Daring Demolition, to use the example from before, I still think Aether Chaser is just a better card.
And so you'd still take it. Because the interesting thing that comes up for me in that scenario is I don't feel like I'm playing a very good deck if it has no removal. Right? I hate the feeling that my opponent could just play something very large and I just don't have any reasonable way to interact with my opponent. Like let's say they go, a couple of artifacts and they're like Free Jam Regent, go. That card's incredibly difficult to interact with from a creature perspective, right? You can't block it very often because it has flying and it kills you very, very quickly. And so, for me, like I view it as like a kind of a checklist as I go through my deck. And yes, I recognize that sometimes the power levels don't work out right, but it's like an insurance policy or it's a thing that you need to have, right? Like even if I can look at a Daring Demolition and a reasonable threat that I think is even better than it, like an Aether Chaser, I'll often take the Daring Demolition because of what Carrie said. It's just hard to find those, that level of card. And I want to make sure that I have those because they do dry up very quickly. So it's an interesting balance, to try to balance that out. Cause I feel like if I get to the end of the draft and I don't have any of that, I'm in trouble. Where, for example, you've got an Aether Chaser and you can compare that to, say, an Eager Construct. How big of a difference are there in those two cards? Well, there's a difference for sure. I mean, Aether Chaser is a significantly better card, but roughly speaking, they replace each other in many ways. If I have a Daring Demolition or nothing, I'm playing another random 4-drop creature or something over it. That's a problem. Like if I don't have removal spells. So.
Yeah, I think that as you get closer to the end of the draft, you can maybe prioritize a little bit more. But overall, I don't start by thinking I need to fill these particular slots in my deck exactly.
All right. Last level up question. Carrie says, how does one improve at knowing the picks and reading the signs? Is it just repetition of drafting and playing to know where you value the cards, or is it based on pick orders? I find myself debating if I'm taking a weaker card in my color or if I should be looking to change colors. Now, to be fair, this is a very big question. It's not Aether Revolt specific. So we'll probably just give kind of the overall pitch here because we've done episodes on this topic before and it's a topic that the show is about this, right?
The reason this is a good question is this is the hardest part of draft.
Yes.
Knowing when to take you have 2 white cards, 2 red cards, knowing whether you should take a green card in 5th pick and move in. Like that is the thing that some people never get. So yeah, it is hard to figure out and it's not easy to summarize, in a short period of time.
No, but to answer your question, you are on the right path, Carrie. It is an experience thing. Absolutely. The more you draft, the more you can read the table and get a feel for what could come back, what couldn't. And it is absolutely, by repetition, knowing where you value the cards and just as importantly, where people drafting at this point value the cards, right? And that's a very weird thing. It requires you to draft often. And, if you want to be really up on it, because you can take advantage of that. There's an arbitrage opportunity there. If everybody else thinks that a card's bad and you think it's good and you're right, then you're going to be able to get that card later than you should. And you want to take advantage of that. But yeah, keep listening, of course, to people that have similar questions. We talk about this stuff a lot on the show and we'll have episodes in the future dedicated to this topic specifically. Carrie also says, thank you for doing the show. You're welcome. Okay, that's it for the questions for Aether Revolt, but we do have some sealed point of interest. You actually did some digging around on Magic Online, did you not?
It was actually a combination of Magic Online and event coverage. One of the things I like to do when it comes to the sealed episode, which we haven't always done over the last couple formats, is besides build a couple sealed decks, which I do, it's actually look at winning sealed decks, because I just love data, and getting to look at 30 lists that of 5.0 or 9.0 sealed decks gives you some relevant information. And you can from that distill, find out what the similarities are between the decks and kind of figure out what's going on more, I think, than just playing a couple, leagues or whatever, even though I think that's a good part of it as well.
Sure. So what'd you find?
First one is 16 land is the most common number.
Okay.
So you can play 17 or 18, but I think you're going to play 16 most of the time. These are for the reasons we mentioned before, which is lower curves, lack of mana sinks. Also, this fits with my second point, which is that most of the winning sealed decks are just 2 colors, the vast majority. So that's another reason to play 16 lands. You're just playing 8 forests, 8 mountains. You don't need a third color. So being able to play 2 colors and then play only 16 lands is certainly an advantage.
Yeah, and by the way, these are very related points here, right?
Yes.
The fact that if you're playing a 2-color deck, it tends to be more consistent. It tends to curve out more, that kind of thing. That actually disincentivizes people to make greedy splashes in their deck, because they know that they're going to be under pressure. Where if all players kind of agree, hey, this format's not that fast, we'll just all play 17, 18 land decks with multiple colors, then, you can get away with that more.
You are going to be aggressive, and you're going to play first.
That's interesting.
Yeah, sealed in this format, it actually contradicts a lot of the sealed wisdom that we use for other formats, which is what I think is interesting. Your opponents are going to curve out. You're going to want to curve out. You're going to want to play tricks, cards I saw a lot of High Spire Infusions and Precise Strikes.
Wow.
These are the kind of cards which in sealed I would almost always sort them into the unplayables.
Right.
Well, when both players are curving out, these are the cards that actually do something. Likewise, sealed's not synergy driven, so themes like Revolt and Improvise tend to not be as well supported. Yes, sometimes you will get 4 cards with Improvise and you can play cheap artifacts. That's great. A lot of times that's not going to happen, and you're just going to want to build a deck based on curve and card quality.
And that's touches on the question we answered earlier, right, about those synergy decks we were talking about with Ed, and this is the opposite, right? This is where you're actually rewarded for just having the solid build.
Yeah. Green is the most played color, so bring
Not
some
surprised,
forests.
Yeah.
The forests will all be taken at the land station. Green just has a good overall card quality, a lot of bomb on commons, good gold cards. So what that means, first of all, is that you should look to pay attention to see if your green's good, but that's going to vary sealed by sealed. Certainly you don't have to play it, but when you're playing against opponents, you're going to want answers for larger ground creatures and efficient creatures in that vein. It's also part of why combat tricks are good, is because if there's a lot of creatures fighting on the ground, you end up wanting to rely on combat tricks. You also you don't want to play your anti-flying cards as much. There have been sealed formats where I'd always main deck Plummet, for example, 1 in a green, kill a flyer,
kill a dragon.
I wouldn't play Takedown here, and I would not main deck it in the sealed format.
Mm-hmm.
And flying is good also, because a lot of decks don't have good ways to answer it, but it's just not as common, and that also does make flying better if you have it.
Right.
The next point, this is true of most sealed formats, still true here, which is you're going to play against a lot of bombs, and Kaladesh and Aether Revolt being artifact sets do exacerbate this, because first of all, the more of the bombs are artifacts, you're walking ballistas and Aether Sphere Harvesters. Second of all, because there's a lot of colorless cards, you can pick almost any 2 colors and build a deck. It is true,
right.
Let's say you open Noxious Gearhulk or Sahili's Artistry, right? These are some bombs from Kaladesh. There are sealed formats where you could open the best card in the set in a color, but only have 6 playables in that color and just not be able to build a 2-color deck with that color. In this format, because you can just fill it out with your Eager Constructs and Dukara P-Fowls and vehicles, you can actually build almost any 2 colors. So if you open these bombs in a specific color, you're going to be able to play that color. So you're going to play against slightly more bombs than you would on average.
God, that's really interesting. I had not considered that.
Yeah. And
yeah, you just get to play your bombs. Like if you want, you can just make that happen and still have enough playables so that you're not just sacrificing a huge amount to get those in there. Interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that just exacerbates the bomb heavy nature of Sealed to begin with. And then some specific card notes. I would main deck 1 or even 2 artifact enchantment removal cards.
Yes. Please do so. I remember what we just talked about, right? I mean, Skyship, Smuggler's Copter, Walking Ballista. I mean, these are some of the best cards in the whole block.
Are colorless, and because in draft, people sometimes pick a colored card over a colorless card, so not everyone has colorless cards. Here you open a mix, but everyone's going to have some artifacts in their deck. It's like almost impossible not to, just because the best 3 to 4 artifacts in your pool, you're always going to play. They're colorless.
Exactly.
So you end up wanting to main deck artifact enchant removal more often.
Yeah, and you get that upside of those bombs that we were discussing too. If you get to nab one of those with a conditional removal spell, you are real happy.
Oh yeah, Release the Gremlins is a card I would go to great lengths to play in my deck. I think it's very good.
Yeah, always has probably a good target. Yeah.
Yeah. And then removal is still good in Sealed. Even clunky removal is still good. You have a little bit more pressure to save removal in Sealed. Like if you have Daring Demolition in your hand and you're in draft and your opponent plays, a 4/4 on turn 4, often you're just going to kill an attack with your 3/3. In Sealed, you're a little bit more likely to want to just play another creature, not get an attack that turn, and then save the Demolition for their Aetherwind Basker or whatever gigantic 7-drop they have, because they're just going to have cards like that in their deck.
Yeah, and you will see those definitely. I did play in the Grand Prix in San Jose, as I talked about on the show, and so I did get a chance to see quite a bit of what was going on with those. And it definitely reflected what you saw from these lists as well, which is there were a significantly higher portion of assertive decks than you would normally see. And I think that that's a function also of what you mentioned with the, I opened a bomb, I'm going to fill out my deck with these colorless cards. A lot of those colorless cards are creatures. They're just artifact creatures. And a lot of them are just like, hey, let's turn sideways. People just sort of end up with, like you mentioned, the eager constructs and stuff. And they're just like, well, 2-drop attack you. And next thing you know, you're getting into this sort of creature combat scenario where sometimes in Sealed, especially in the gold sets like cons and things like that, that was not the case at all. People were playing much slower decks with much more robust long game plans and mana sinks and things like that. And that isn't quite the case here. And in fact, the deck that I played at the GP was that as well. It was a black-white Revolt deck that was a little short on Revolt enablers, but pretty good on Revolt payoffs. I mean, as far as that goes. But ultimately, I was a curve out deck. That's what I was trying to do. I was trying to just keep pressure on my opponent. I would have absolutely murdered for an Inspire charge, for example. And I'll tell you what, I don't normally say that type of sentence about Sealed deck, So that is a telling thing, I think.
I think the biggest takeaway here is that this Sealed format is just 2 colors, 16 lands, aggressive. And once you have that mindset, then you won't fall into the trap, which I did the first time I played Sealed, which is building a deck with more value cards, a little bit slower, not playing combat tricks, and then just kind of getting run over. So,
yeah. If you're going to face those decks, it's tough because that's a real trap, right? I mean, like we're used to building the decks like you described, and then if you're just going to be facing curve out decks all day, it's really going to go bad for you.
I mean, often in Sealed, like you want to build the deck where you draw first and you play 17 lands and some good card draw ish spells or card advantage spells, and you're splashing and all this stuff. You're just trying to increase the total power level in your long game. It just, those tools aren't there in this format, and the aggressive tools are very strong. So this is an aggressive format that's reflected in the Sealed. It's not always like that, but it is in this format.
Before we wrap up, do you view vehicles as a big part of that equation, like as to why we're seeing them? Okay.
Yeah, vehicles are just really good aggressive cards, and they're really hard, and they're punishing on control.
Okay, good stuff. All right, so that's going to do it for the show this week. We really appreciate everybody on the Patreon in general, and then also those of you who ask us questions and help us out with the show and stuff, because this is one of the really neat things about Patreon is that it gives us a place where I can put these things and actually access, our most dedicated listeners. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to ask such thoughtful questions. And I was glad we got to get to the rest of them this week. That is going to do it though for the show this week. If you want to find us on social media, it's easy. I am Marshall_LR on everything. And Luis is LSV on everything. You can find us there. If you want to find anything specific about the show. For example, I mentioned the Limited Resources YouTube channel, that kind of thing. We've got all types of stuff going on. You can find it all at lrcast.com. Right on the front page, there's a list of links where you can find all of our stuff, all the content that we make all over the internet. And it's an easy, just sort of go there. It'll be there, and you can link off to that. I also want to thank our sponsor, channelfireball.com. They are the place to go on the internet for everything you need Magic related. And I mentioned the content earlier, such great stuff. If you're into Constructed, you're going to find sideboarding guides, deck lists, that kind of stuff so that you know what you're going to play in your next tournament and how to play it, just as importantly. It's not just about deck lists anymore. We have moved past that phase of Magic. Before, it would just be like you could go to a website, download a deck list, build the deck, and you would have a huge edge because other people weren't doing that. And just by virtue of the fact that you had a strong functioning list meant that you would have a big edge. Now everybody does it. And so you need that next level. And that next level is Owen Turtenwald telling you how to play the deck and how to sideboard. It's Reed Duke giving you instructions. And you're going to find those type of things for free on channelfireball.com on the content side. And while you're there, hey, you know the deal. Check out the singles, the sealed product, all that kind of stuff to finish off those decks. That's it. That's going to do it for the show this week. We'll see you next time.
So nonsense that's going around on Facebook right now, of all things, is people asking for top 5 lists. So I put together.
Oh, yeah, I've seen this. This is where somebody posts that black picture.
Yeah. Look, I hate memes like that. I'm not going to do it on Facebook, but I do like ranking things. So
all right.
I've got 5 top 5 lists, and we'll start from the top down, I guess. We'll start with the Magic related ones and then stray a little bit.
Okay.
Let's rank the colors. Number 5 is white.
The colors. There's 5 colors in Magic. How perfect. Yeah. White is last. Yes, that's true.
Yes, white is last. Look, I like white because it has sideboard cards and Swords to Plowshares. Other than that, it really does not do much for me. Mm-hmm. Red.
Okay.
Look,
yeah.
I like Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt's great, Beta Lightning Bolt especially, but honestly, like red decks are just not that interesting for me. So I'm not ranking red quite as highly as say green. Green would be next. And I like curving mana elves into bigger things. That is pretty sweet. And there's been some good fun green decks over the years. Black is of course number 2. Removal spells, card draw at a cost of life. Like I've enjoyed playing black cards. And then of course blue is number 1 because it just does everything you actually want to do in a game of Magic and does it quite well.
I'm not shocked, but our ranking is identical. So
no it's not. Yeah. Next up, we're going to rank shards. These are the shards of Alara.
So these are the three groups of 3 that are all around one color. Okay.
Yeah. So Jund is the red shard. So that's red, green, black. Look, Jund gets the lowest ranking because the Jund deck in Standard was so painfully boring to play against that I just could not stand it. So, sorry,
screw
Jund.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, Jund just means any grindy green-black deck now. It's just like, I'm just off it. Bant is next because Bant's the most forgettable shard of all. It's actually just like, what do you mean what? Bant is just so boring. No one's ever made a Bant deck. That's just not even.
Dude, Exalted. My first constructed deck that I ever made was a Bant deck around Rafika the Many. How dare you say that? All
right. Well, anyway. Next up, we have Esper, white, black, blue.
Okay.
I like Esper Control. Esper Control has been a fun part of the Magic experience for me. It is got a lot of the tools that I want, but it just slightly loses to Grixis, which is number 2, because Grixis Control is even better. Snapcaster, Lightning Bolt.
Esper and Grixis are number 2 and 3 for you?
Well, the power rankings have changed recently. I might have evidenced a little bit of of bias here. I'm going to have to say that Naya is number 1.
All right. I get it. I was going to say
obligated to.
I was going to say I did not have you as a woolly Thoktar guy, but hey.
Look, I 16-0'd the Pro Tour with Naya. Yeah.
You did. That's true. All right. All right. I get it. Fair rankings.
So then for formats, so these are Magic formats. Standard is number 5. I like Standard. It's got some gameplay to it. I don't mind watching it. Covering it is not too bad either. We're going to cover some Standard over the next couple months. I can assure you that.
Yes.
But it's not my favorite format. In fact, it's number 5. Modern, I have it number 4. Though I will admit, if we were ranking formats to cover, Modern is hands down my favorite format to do coverage of. I actually love covering Modern.
Oh, it's great. And it's also the most popular by a lot.
Yes. I was jealous that you guys got to cover it in Vancouver. It is just a very fun format to cover.
Yes.
Playing it is solid, but the games are pretty fast and linear, so it's not as I like covering it more than playing it.
Okay.
Number 3 is Pauper. I actually do enjoy playing Pauper. I haven't played it in a while, but I always had fun playing it. It's just hard to find time to play a largely, don't kill me, Pauper players, irrelevant format. in that it doesn't prepare me for any of the tournaments I'm going to play in or cover. So I do like it. The Pauper's all commons, by the way. Number 2 is Vintage. It's the opposite of Pauper. I love Vintage. It's one of my favorite formats. In fact, my second favorite format of all time. I like casting Black Lotus and Ancestral Recall and activating Library of Alexandria and
that is not good stuff.
Not and Force of Willing, whatever Mishra's Workshop is casting, that sort of thing.
And I should mention, by the way, that if you're a fan of Vintage, the Vintage Super League is something that I watch every week that it's out. It's really fun, and it goes on the Magic Twitch channel. So Tuesdays. That is my main connection with Vintage. I mean, I don't have a Vintage deck or anything. I never played it prior, and I've kind of gotten into it just from watching on VSL.
Yeah, I liked some of the previous seasons as well.
Yeah, I'm sure you did.
And then number 1 is Draft. I'm not even saying that because we're on the podcast. If I like Vintage more, I would just say that. But honestly, if I had to choose to, what format the next Pro Tour was going to be in, if it had to be all the rounds of the same format, I would just choose Draft. I just love Draft, and it is fun to draft. So I'm in for Booster Draft and as being the best format. It's just so dynamic. It always changes. It's always interesting. There's always puzzles to figure out, and you get to customize it so much. And the games are so novel. Part of the fun of Limited as opposed to Constructed is in Constructed, if I play 30 games of Mardu vehicles against Black-Green, I'll start to notice patterns, and I'll know how the games play out. And you can probably distill them into 5 or 6 different types of games. It just does not work that way for Limited. Every game is an adventure. So that is why Draft is the best format.
You forgot Canadian Highlander, but I'll forgive you.
I did.
If you played it, it would be on the list. I swear.
All right. This next one is still related to Magic. It's a little different. This is the top 5 color commentators.
Oh, buddy. You're going to wade into this pool, huh? All right.
To be clear, this is just color commentators. So you were not eligible for this, even though sometimes you dabble. I have you, by the way, as the best play-by-play commentator in the business. So.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So, color commentators. We'll start with honorable mention, Paulo Vitor Damarosa. I think Paulo's great. I'm looking forward to how he does at GP Porto Alegre with you, in fact.
Yes, I'm going to be covering that in Brazil with him in a few weeks' time. And I've been in the booth with him at GP San Jose, and he was fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a top 5. This is a tough list to crack.
Yes. And I also excluded myself from the list. I'm not sure if I would have made the top 5, but
I think it's safe to say that you would have been on the top 5. Yes.
But yeah, I think Paulo's great. I think that I would like to see him do more, and I think that we're going too soon. Number 5, I've got Ben Stark. I think Bennis is great. He offers good analysis. He goes very deep. So he's not maybe the best entry-level color commentator. If you turned on a Magic broadcast having not watched one before and Bennis is at the helm, you might be led astray a little bit. But I think that his analysis is excellent. And,
it's so good.
And he's very good at seeing the game within the game, what players are thinking, what their next moves might be.
Plus, he's inadvertently hilarious.
Yes, he also I think one of if I had to make top 5 coverage moments, one of them is the clip of him pulling a bowl of Chipotle and starting to start eating because he didn't realize he was on camera.
Yeah, I mean, Ben encapsulates a wide range. Let's just say he's got some of the best coverage moments and the worst as well. So yes,
no, that sounds like the best and the best. For number 4, I've got Simon Gertzen. Simon is awesome. I think. One of the reasons I actually like watching him so much is that he does Euro GPs, which I don't go to or cover, so I get to watch him. And having watched a lot of Simon commentate, I think that he does a very, very good job of breaking everything down and, analyzing the gameplay correctly. And I just find him a pleasure to watch. Plus, he's an awesome guy.
Say he's hervorragend.
I don't know if that's appropriate, but
Spitze.
Okay.
No, he's fantastic. Yep.
Number 3 is a new addition to the scene, Paul Chia. And I again,
with a bullet.
I'm not saying this because I'm biased, and he's one of my friends, even though he is one of my best friends. It's because I watched the last 2 GPs, Vancouver and whichever the one was, Pittsburgh before Vancouver, and I think Paul just knocked it out of the park. He's just very, very skilled at it, enthusiastic, good analysis. Like he just brings, you'd expect a silver or gold level pro to the table to bring.
Honestly, though, I was blown away by Paul. for me, it takes some time. We have to get used to each other in the booth, and I don't really know what to expect when somebody's new to the booth, relatively speaking, like Paul was. And, I was all ready to kind of help him out and work on him a bit and get him to where he wanted to be. And he just stepped in and smashed it. And I was like, and to be honest, in Pittsburgh, I felt kind of off. I didn't have, like, I was kind of sick and I wasn't really feeling good. And he just smashed it. And then in Vancouver, he did the same. And he just jumped in my rankings too. I'm like, wow, he's just one of the best commentators, and he's been in the booth for 2 GPs. He's really, really impressive stuff from Paul.
Yeah, and I think he does crack this list, and I'm excited to see more from Paul here.
Me too. I wanted to work with him more,
and I'm sure you'll get a chance to. Next, I have Patrick Sullivan, P. Sully. And this was actually really hard because I think that between number 2 and number 1 are very close for me. I think P. Sully and his work on the Star City game circuit is, above reproach. He actually happens to be a coworker of mine now. So, look, I bias all over the place. I'm actually friends with all 5 people on this list.
You're friends with everybody, though.
Am I even allowed to make this list?
Yes.
No, I think P. Sully is excellent. I think he does a fantastic job. He's got a very dry sense of humor, and I do enjoy watching him. He also has a little freer reign than a lot of the other commentators. We'll just say that. So
that is true. He does.
I enjoy his rants. He gets to make more rants than we do, and I think that's very fun.
It's good to watch. Yeah, I'm a huge Patrick Sullivan fan. I've been watching him in the booth for a long time, and he's the one person that I've never got to be in the booth with that I really, really, really want to, and I think I'm going to get to soon. So I'm really excited to get to work with him, because when you do this stuff for a living, you can't help but I'm just like I'm like jealous of Cedric. He gets just to work with Patrick Sullivan all the time, and I mean, I'm not complaining. I get to work with fantastic people too, but Patrick and I get along really well. We have a lot of the same interests outside of Magic, and then I just think he's stellar in the booth. His delivery and all that stuff, and I think that him and I would get along really well. And I'm just like, I'm pretty sure I finally get to be and do a round with Patrick Sullivan. I'm really excited about it. And
for number 1, I've got William Jensen, Huey. And again, bias alert, but Huey's really grown on me. I think that he, like Benes, has a very dry sense of humor. Actually, so does Patrick Sullivan. In fact, so does Simon. In fact, everyone here but Paul has a very dry sense of humor. Does that mean Paul has a very wet sense of humor?
Maybe. I don't really want to think of that.
But I think that Huey does a very good job of breaking things down, analyzing. He's a Hall of Fame Magic player. Both Ben and Huey are actually in the Hall of Fame, and they bring that expert analysis to the table. So I would say that all of these people are tier 1 in my book, like with a bullet. But this is the rankings I've got right now.
I mean, Huey's the nuts. Yeah. I mean, he's just.
I think so too. Yeah. So that's 4 out of my 5 lists. The number 1 list, inspired by the Marshallog blog cliff. I'm gonna rank fast food burgers because you started this discussion.
I did. I opened it up, and boy, most of the comments on that video are about that somehow.
Yeah.
But
well, I'm gonna start at number 5, In-N-Out. Look, I'm a native of California.
Wow.
I get it. I've been In-N-Out many times. It is overrated. I will tell you that. Yes, it's better than Burger King or McDonald's. It's not the end-all be all of burgers. It is just fine. But it cracks the list.
By the way, I'm going to remain silent here because I said what I needed to say on the blog cliff, and I don't want to muddy the waters here anymore. So I just want to hear what you have to say.
Number 4 is Whataburger, the Texas chain, as far as I know, which I've been to a number of times, and it's fine. It's good. I don't think it's
Which,
bad.
by the way, I got yelled at because I've never had that, and I didn't put it on the list. So and people are like, what about Whataburger?
It makes the list for sure.
Okay.
Number 3, I've got Five Guys. These are like in my opinion, the most real seeming burgers because they are like, I don't know, they just feel like the no frills, just a giant burger.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the Five Guys burgers are quite good. They give you like a burlap sack full of fries, which is actually just a bit much. And if I'm saying it's a bit much,
in a cup, it's just
strange. Number 2, I've got Shake Shack, something I've recently started having. Had the pleasure of having it a few times.
All right, wait, this is number 2.
Yes, that is number 2.
You have Shake Shack at number 2, not number 1.
Yes.
All right. I'm gonna. This isn't good. Maybe I just need to exit the room. Or
okay. Well, number 1, I've got White Castle actually, and look, I've got a couple of reasons. For
what?
Okay. First of all, there's literally a movie made about a quest.
Oh, come on!
The burgers are so good they made a movie about it. Second of all, you get so many at once.
No.
Quantity implies quality. And I think overall, it's
Oh
very
my
clear
God.
that,
I'm done.
White Castle's at the top of the burger power rankings.
No,
and
I'm done.
show.